The morning sun streamed through the small oval windows of Flight 2317, casting dancing shadows across the cabin as the aircraft climbed steadily through the clouds. Flight attendant Linda Chen walked down the narrow aisle with practiced grace, her experienced eyes scanning the cabin as she had done countless times during her 12 years with Skyline Airways. Today's Chicago-bound flight was nearly full, filled with the usual mix of business travelers tapping away on laptops and families heading for weekend getaways. As Linda reached row 14, she noticed a sophisticated woman in a navy blazer discreetly raising her hand. Dr. Amara Wilson, though Linda didn't know her name or credentials yet, had already requested water 3 times since takeoff. The weather report had warned of turbulent conditions ahead, and the crew had been strictly instructed to conserve water supplies for the lengthy flight. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Linda said with a practiced smile, "but I'll have to ask you to wait until our next scheduled beverage service." She noticed a slight furrow in the passenger's brow, a subtle tightening around her eyes, but the woman simply nodded and turned back to the medical journal in her lap. The cabin hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt signs to ping on. Linda steadied herself against the seat back, her mind already running through safety protocols. As she continued her rounds, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woman in 14C kept glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, her attention seemingly drawn to something, or someone, several rows ahead. Through the galley curtain, Linda could hear her colleague Michael discussing the weather report with the cockpit. "Rough air all the way to Chicago," he muttered as she passed. She nodded, remembering the morning briefing about conserving supplies in case they needed to take an alternate route around the storm system. The woman in 14C pressed her call button again. Linda's steps slowed as she approached, preparing to explain the water rationing policy once more. But this time, she noticed something different in the passenger's expression. Not irritation or entitlement, but genuine concern. There was a quiet intensity in her eyes that made Linda pause. "I understand the policy," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a calm authority that caught Linda's attention. "But I need to stay hydrated for what's coming." Before Linda could ask what she meant, the call button chimed again, this time from row 9. Little did Linda know that in exactly 6 minutes, everything about this routine flight would change. The true reason behind the repeated water requests would become clear, and her split-second decisions in the next few moments would challenge everything she thought she knew about first impressions and unconscious biases. The cabin lights flickered briefly as another wave of turbulence rocked the plane. Linda gripped the overhead bin, steadying herself. She glanced back at 14C, where the mysterious passenger was now making notes in the margins of her medical journal, her eyes frequently darting to check the time on her elegant wristwatch. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, like the calm before a storm. Some passengers had drifted off to sleep, while others chatted quietly or watched movies on their tablets. None of them realized they were about to become part of a story that would challenge perspectives and remind everyone aboard that heroes often emerge in the most unexpected moments. Through the small window beside her seat, Dr. Wilson watched the clouds darken outside, her hand absently reaching for a water bottle that wasn't there. She checked her watch again. 5 minutes had passed. Her medical training told her that time was running out, but years of experience had taught her to stay calm in the face of impending crisis. The tension in the cabin grew thicker than the clouds outside. Several passengers had noticed the exchanges between Linda and Dr. Wilson, their eyes darting back and forth like spectators at a tennis match. A young college student 2 rows behind removed her earbuds, suddenly more interested in the real-life drama unfolding than her movie. Dr. Wilson shifted in her seat, trying to maintain her professional composure. After 20 years as a cardiologist at City General Hospital, she had developed an almost sixth sense for medical emergencies. Right now, that sense was screaming at her. From her seat in 14C, she had a clear view of an elderly gentleman 5 rows ahead, and what she saw worried her deeply. The man's complexion had been steadily graying over the past hour. His breathing pattern showed subtle changes that only a trained medical eye would notice, slightly too rapid, slightly too shallow. She had been monitoring him discreetly, not wanting to cause unnecessary alarm, but knowing she needed to stay alert and hydrated in case her expertise was needed. A flight attendant walked past with a garbage bag, collecting empty cups and snack wrappers. Dr. Wilson noticed how the elderly passenger's hand trembled as he handed over his empty coffee cup. His wedding ring caught the light, reminding her of her own father. She took a deep breath, fighting the familiar frustration of being in situations where her credentials were overlooked. "Could I please speak to the lead flight attendant?" she asked quietly as Linda passed by again. But before Linda could respond, the plane hit another patch of turbulence. Drinks rattled in the galley, and a child somewhere behind them let out a startled yelp. A businesswoman across the aisle glanced up from her laptop, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. She had witnessed all three of Dr. Wilson's rejected water requests, and something about the doctor's calm persistence made her uneasy. The woman closed her laptop and leaned slightly closer. "Are you okay?" she whispered, genuine concern in her voice. Dr. Wilson managed a small smile. "I'm fine," she replied softly, "just keeping an eye on something." Her attention never wavered from the elderly passenger, who was now dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. The cabin pressure felt heavier somehow, though the altitude hadn't changed. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and the sound seemed to emphasize the growing unease. Dr. Wilson checked her watch again. The timing would be critical. In her 2 decades of medical practice, she had learned that emergencies rarely announce themselves with dramatic flair. Instead, they crept in quietly, hiding behind ordinary moments until suddenly they weren't ordinary anymore. Linda passed through the cabin again, this time noticing how Dr. Wilson's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles slightly white with tension. For a moment, their eyes met, and Linda saw something in the passenger's expression that made her pause. Not anger or entitlement, but genuine professional concern. The elderly man in row 9 coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Dr. Wilson sit up straighter. She reached for the flight magazine in her seat pocket, but her real attention was focused on counting the seconds between his breaths. 20 years of emergency room experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling her to be ready. Outside, the afternoon sun played hide and seek with the clouds, casting shifting shadows through the cabin. The plane hummed steadily onward, carrying its passengers through the sky, each person wrapped in their own world of thoughts and concerns. None of them realized that in mere moments, all their attention would be focused on a single point, and the true reason behind Dr. Wilson's persistence would become heartbreakingly clear. 6 minutes. That's all it took for everything to change. The first sign wasn't dramatic, just a soft gasp from row 9 that could easily have been mistaken for a response to turbulence. But Dr. Wilson knew better. She had been watching, waiting, preparing for this moment. The elderly man's newspaper slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the cabin floor. His head lolled slightly to one side, and his breathing became noticeably labored. The passenger next to him, a young woman with wireless earbuds, was too engrossed in her movie to notice immediately. "Sir?" The voice came from a concerned passenger across the aisle. "Sir, are you all right?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The man's face had taken on an alarming bluish tinge. Linda was at the back of the plane when she heard the first shout for help. She turned quickly, nearly colliding with her drink cart. The scene before her seemed to unfold in slow motion. Passengers turning in their seats, worried faces peering over headrests, the growing murmur of concern spreading through the cabin like a wave. "Is there a doctor on board?" Linda's voice carried through the cabin, professional but urgent. She was already moving forward, her training kicking in even as her heart raced. The elderly man's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His lips had turned an alarming shade of blue, and his chest heaved with desperate, ineffective breaths. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, pressed his face against the window, trying to distract himself from the scary scene. His mother held him close, whispering reassuring words. The businesswoman who had noticed Dr. Wilson earlier was now standing halfway out of her seat, her laptop forgotten. "He's not breathing right." The young woman next to him had finally noticed, yanking her earbuds out in panic. Her voice cracked with fear. "Someone help him." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, making it harder for Linda to maintain her balance as she rushed forward. The seatbelt sign dinged on, its cheerful chime seeming oddly inappropriate amid the crisis. 2 rows behind, a baby started crying, adding to the growing chaos. Dr. Wilson stood up, her movements calm and purposeful. The same flight attendant who had denied her water was now just a few feet away, face pale with concern. Their eyes met briefly, understanding passing between them in a flash. "Started about an hour ago," Dr. Wilson said quietly as she moved past Linda. "I noticed the signs: shortness of breath, color changes, confusion. That's why I kept asking for water. I needed to stay hydrated in case." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what she meant. The cabin had become eerily quiet, save for the hum of the engines and the elderly man's labored breathing. Passengers watched in tense silence as Dr. Wilson reached his row. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, and his fingers clutched weakly at his armrest. "Sir, I'm a doctor," she said clearly, kneeling beside his seat despite the turbulence. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered, but he couldn't respond. Every breath seemed to be a struggle. Linda stood nearby, her earlier interaction with Dr. Wilson replaying in her mind. The weight of her assumptions felt heavier than all her years of airline training combined. But there was no time for guilt now. They had a life to save. "I need the emergency medical kit," Dr. Wilson said firmly. "And get me that water now." The authority in her voice left no room for hesitation. Linda nodded and rushed to the galley, her footsteps quick and purposeful. The next few moments would test everyone on board. As the plane continued its journey through turbulent skies, the true meaning of judgment, expertise, and human connection was about to unfold at 35,000 feet. Linda returned with the emergency medical kit, her hands steady despite her racing heart. As she watched Dr. Wilson work, the reality of the situation hit her like a physical force. The woman she had repeatedly denied water to was now their best hope for saving a life. "BP is dropping," Dr. Wilson announced, her fingers expertly working the blood pressure cuff from the kit. The elderly man's wife had joined them now, her face etched with worry as she clutched her husband's hand. "How long until we can land?" she asked, her eyes never leaving her patient. The cockpit had already been notified, but the nearest airport was still over an hour away. Storm systems blocked any potential emergency landing sites, leaving them to handle this crisis in the clouds. Dr. Wilson nodded, as if she had expected this answer. She had been preparing for this scenario since she first noticed the warning signs. "That's why I kept requesting water," she explained, her voice calm as she worked. "I could see his condition deteriorating from my seat. Proper hydration is crucial for what I might need to do." She pulled an oxygen mask from the kit, quickly setting it up. "I've been monitoring him since we took off." The slight tremor in his hands, the gradual color changes, the irregular breathing patterns. Around them, passengers watched in stunned silence. The young college student who had been observing earlier was recording everything on her phone, though Linda gently asked her to stop out of respect for the patient's privacy. The businesswoman who had spoken to Dr. Wilson earlier was now helping by holding supplies, her laptop forgotten in her seat. "I'm a cardiologist at City General," Dr. Wilson continued, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed her patient. 20 years in emergency medicine teaches you to spot the early warning signs. I knew we might need immediate medical intervention, and I needed to be ready. Linda felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Shame at her earlier dismissiveness mingled with admiration for Dr. Wilson's professionalism. Despite being treated with suspicion, this remarkable doctor had stayed focused on what really mattered, protecting her potential patient. The elderly man's breathing began to stabilize under Dr. Wilson's care. Color slowly returned to his face as the oxygen took effect. His wife wept quietly with relief, still holding his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "We've been married for 45 years. I can't lose him now." Dr. Wilson smiled warmly at her. "He's responding well to treatment. Those water requests weren't for me. They were part of my preparation to help him. In emergency medicine, we learn to stay one step ahead. I knew if something happened, I needed to be properly hydrated to provide care for as long as necessary." The revelation rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier interactions now understood the full story. The young mother who had been comforting her scared child explained quietly to him how the doctor had been watching over everyone, like a guardian angel in disguise. Linda brought Dr. Wilson the water she had asked for earlier, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Dr. Wilson shook her head. "You were following protocol," she said kindly. "But sometimes we need to look deeper than our first impressions. Every rule has a context. Every person has a story." The elderly man squeezed his wife's hand, his eyes now clear and alert. Through the oxygen mask, he managed a weak smile. Dr. Wilson checked his vital signs again, nodding with satisfaction. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. She would stay with him until they landed, monitoring his condition, ready to act if needed. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the scene. In that light, everyone could see what they had missed before. Not just a passenger requesting water, but a medical professional preparing to save a life. The cabin atmosphere had transformed from one of tension to one of profound respect and understanding. Working together now felt as natural as breathing. Linda and Dr. Wilson moved around each other with the coordinated grace of dancers, each anticipating the other's needs. The initial tension between them had dissolved in the face of their shared mission, keeping their patient stable until they could land safely. "Blood pressure's improving," Dr. Wilson announced, her skilled fingers checking the elderly man's pulse. "But we need to monitor him closely." She glanced at the oxygen tank's gauge, making quick calculations in her head. Linda, catching her concerned look, was already on her way to check for backup supplies. The elderly man's wife, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, hadn't left her husband's side. She shared how they were flying to Chicago to meet their first grandchild. "Little Amy was born yesterday," she explained, her voice trembling. "Robert was so excited, he barely slept last night." Dr. Wilson adjusted Mr. Chen's oxygen mask, her touch gentle but sure. "Well, we're going to make sure you meet Amy," she said warmly. "Your grandfather duties are just beginning." The quiet strength in her voice brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes. Linda returned with additional supplies, having rearranged the entire medical kit for easier access. She had also brought extra pillows to help position Mr. Chen more comfortably. "I radioed ahead," she reported. "Emergency medical team will meet us at the gate. We're getting priority landing clearance." The surrounding passengers had become part of their support team. The businesswoman offered her cashmere scarf as an extra blanket. A young teacher in row 12 helped keep other passengers calm by explaining what was happening in simple, reassuring terms. Even the college student who had been recording earlier now helped by taking notes about vital signs and time intervals as Dr. Wilson called them out. "This is why I always carry hard candies on flights," Dr. Wilson shared as she checked Mr. Chen's blood sugar levels. "You never know when they might be needed." She smiled at Linda. "Though staying hydrated is equally important when you might need to provide emergency care." Linda felt a deep respect growing as she watched Dr. Wilson work. Every action was precise, every decision backed by years of experience. "I've learned more in the past 30 minutes than in a decade of emergency training," she admitted quietly. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, but this time they were ready. Linda steadied the IV line while Dr. Wilson maintained her position beside Mr. Chen. Their teamwork had become seamless. Their earlier misunderstanding transformed into a powerful partnership. Other flight attendants helped by keeping the aisle clear and managing regular cabin duties. They had witnessed the shift in Linda's attitude and followed her lead, their professional training enhanced by this real-world crisis. Your quick thinking with the medical kit made a huge difference, Dr. Wilson commented as Linda handed her fresh supplies. Every second counts in situations like these. The praise was genuine, acknowledging how their different types of expertise had come together perfectly. Mr. Chen's color continued to improve, and his breathing became more regular. He managed to whisper a joke about dramatic entrances to Chicago, making both his wife and Dr. Wilson smile. The crisis wasn't over, but they had formed a solid team to handle whatever came next. A young girl from a few rows back drew a picture of the airplane heroes, showing Linda and Dr. Wilson working together to help Mr. Chen. Her mother brought it forward, slightly embarrassed, but both women were touched by the child's perspective on their teamwork. As the sun began to set outside the airplane windows, casting a warm glow through the cabin, Linda realized that this experience had changed her forever. She had learned that true professionalism isn't just about following rules. It's about recognizing and respecting expertise in all its forms. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. As Mr. Chen's condition stabilized, a wave of relief swept through the plane. The tension that had filled the air just hours ago was replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. Passengers who had been strangers now chatted quietly, sharing their perspectives on the dramatic events they had witnessed. "I've never seen anything like it," whispered the businesswoman to her seatmate. "The way they worked together after everything that happened." She shook her head in amazement, remembering how she had watched the earlier water requests with disapproval. Now she understood the deeper story behind those moments. Linda stood in the galley, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured a fresh cup of water, this time for herself. The events of the past hour played through her mind like scenes from a movie. She thought about how quickly she had judged Dr. Wilson, making assumptions based on nothing more than a few brief interactions. "You know," came a gentle voice behind her, "in the emergency room, we see this all the time." Dr. Wilson had stepped into the galley for a quick break, confident that Mr. Chen was stable enough for her to step away briefly. People are so much more than what we first see. The cabin crew gathered around, drawn by the natural warmth and wisdom in Dr. Wilson's voice. She shared stories from her years in emergency medicine, talking about how quick judgments could have cost lives, and how learning to look deeper had made her a better doctor. "I remember my first day as a resident," she said, smiling at the memory. "I was so focused on proving myself that I almost missed what a patient was really trying to tell me. A more experienced doctor pulled me aside and taught me something I'll never forget. Every person has a story, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen." Back in the cabin, passengers were writing notes of thanks. A young artist had sketched the scene on her tablet, capturing the moment when prejudice gave way to partnership. The college student who had tried to record earlier was now writing a reflection for her journalism class, focusing on how crisis can bridge divides and reveal our shared humanity. Linda watched as Mr. Chen's wife showed Dr. Wilson pictures of their new granddaughter on her phone. The joy in their faces was contagious, spreading through the cabin like sunshine after a storm. Even the baby, who had been crying earlier, was now peacefully asleep, as if sensing the change in the atmosphere. "We're starting our descent into Chicago," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Emergency medical teams are standing by. And," there was a pause, "I want to thank our incredible crew and the doctor on board for their outstanding work today." Spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. Mr. Chen, now sitting up more comfortably and breathing steadily, joined in despite his weakness. His wife wiped happy tears from her eyes, knowing they would soon be meeting their granddaughter after all. The young mother who had been comforting her scared child earlier used the moment as a teaching opportunity. "See," she said softly, "this is why we shouldn't judge people before we know their whole story." Her son nodded thoughtfully, his eyes wide with understanding beyond his years. As they began their descent, Linda took a moment to walk through the cabin, checking on passengers. She paused at each row, really seeing the people in her care for perhaps the first time. Every face held a story. Every person carried their own expertise and experiences. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and pink, a beautiful backdrop to the profound changes that had taken place at 35,000 feet. In the soft light, Linda could see how this flight had become more than just another journey. It had become a lesson in humanity that none of them would ever forget. 3 months after that life-changing flight, the airport coffee shop buzzed with morning energy. Linda sat across from Dr. Wilson, both women smiling as they shared updates over steaming cups of coffee. The story of their flight had spread far beyond that Chicago-bound plane, touching hearts and changing minds across the airline industry. "You won't believe what happened yesterday," Linda said, stirring her coffee. "We had our monthly staff training, and now there's a whole new section about looking beyond first impressions." She pulled out her phone to show Dr. Wilson photos of the new training materials. "Your story, our story, is being used to teach flight crews across the country." Dr. Wilson nodded, her eyes warm with appreciation. "The hospital's been different too. After our story got out, we started a new program for medical staff about unconscious bias in emergency care." She paused, remembering. "You know, that flight changed more than just our lives." They had kept in touch with the Chens, who sent regular updates about little Amy's growth. The latest photo showed Mr. Chen, now fully recovered, holding his granddaughter in a garden full of blooming flowers. "He sends me a thank you message every month," Dr. Wilson shared, her voice soft with emotion. But really, it was all of us working together that made the difference. The college students' article about their flight had gone viral online, sparking discussions about judgment, expertise, and the importance of looking beyond surface impressions. Comments poured in from around the world, with people sharing their own stories of times when quick judgments had almost led to disaster, and times when open minds had saved the day. "Remember that little girl who drew our picture?" Linda asked, pulling out a folded paper from her wallet. The child's artwork had been reproduced in the airline's monthly magazine, alongside a story about transformative moments in aviation. "Her mother wrote to tell me she wants to become a doctor now. Says she learned that heroes come in all forms." The businesswoman from the flight had started a social media campaign called Second Look, encouraging people to share moments when they discovered unexpected depth in others. It had taken off, with millions of shares and countless stories of prejudice overcome through understanding. Linda's supervisor had initially called her in for a meeting about breaking water rationing protocols. But after hearing the full story and seeing the impact it had made, the airline changed its policies. Now, flight crews were trained to listen more carefully to passengers who might have expertise to share in emergency situations. "You taught me something I'll never forget," Linda admitted, watching the morning sunlight play across her coffee cup. "Real strength isn't in sticking to rules blindly. It's in knowing when to trust and when to learn from others." Dr. Wilson reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "And you taught me about grace," she replied. "How someone can acknowledge a mistake and turn it into an opportunity for change. That's rare, and it's valuable." They both looked up as the airport screens displayed incoming flights. Somewhere above them, planes crossed the sky, carrying people with their own stories, their own expertise, their own opportunities to learn from each other. The world felt smaller somehow, more connected since their shared experience. "Oh, I almost forgot." Linda pulled out an envelope. "The airline's starting a passenger expert program. We're inviting medical professionals to register so we can better coordinate during emergencies. They want you to be the first member and help design the training." Dr. Wilson smiled, touched by the gesture. Life has a funny way of turning difficult moments into doorways, doesn't it? She mused. One flight, one moment of tension, and look at all the good that's come from it. As they finished their coffee, both women reflected on how a single flight had sparked a movement of understanding and respect. Their story had become more than just an incident report or a viral moment. It had become a reminder that every interaction carries the potential for transformation, and that the biggest changes often start with the smallest moments of understanding.